In the real world, as we work on the new features, modify existing ones, or fix bugs, we need to make changes to our model. With the database first workflow, we always start with a database. So we make changes in the database, and then we refresh our model. And this is the topic of this lecture. I'm going to show you a few different scenarios that you will face in the real-world applications. Adding a new table, or modifying or deleting an existing one. So let's start with adding a new table. So here in SQL Server Management Studio, I'm going to create a new table called User Profile. Now, I'm going to stick to only one column in this table because the process is exactly the same, whether you have one column or 100 columns. I don't want to waste your time adding multiple columns here. So let's call this table User Profiles. Now we go back to Visual Studio. With our model open in the designer, we right-click on an empty area and select Update Model from Database. Here we have three tabs: Add, Refresh, and Delete. The Add tab shows any objects in the database that we currently do not have in our entity data model. So let's expand our tables. Look, we've got a new table that does not exist in our entity data model. So I'm going to select that. We also have a bunch of stored procedures and functions that do not exist in our entity data model. But that's a topic for a separate lecture. All I want to emphasize here is that the Add tab shows the objects that are in the database that do not exist in our entity data model. The Refresh tab shows all objects in our entity data model that will be refreshed when we click the Finish button. So if you click here, you see we've got these tables here. So all of these will be refreshed. Now, one of the mistakes that a lot of beginners with the Entity Framework make is that they assume that the current tab determines what's going to happen when we click the Finish button. So in this case, because the Refresh tab is open, they assume nothing will be added. But that's not the case at all. When you click the Finish button here, any objects that you have selected in the Add tab will be added. All existing objects in the Entity Data Model will be refreshed. And anything that you have deleted from your database that is currently in the Entity Data Model will be deleted. So let's go ahead and click Finish. Okay. Let's scroll down. There it is. Our new table is now successfully mapped to a new entity called User Profile. Let's take a look at this entity and the associated table in the model browser. So in the model browser, Pluto model, under entity types, look, this is our new entity, User Profile. Also, under store model, let's open tables. Here's the User Profiles table. So pretty easy. Now, let's take a look at the second scenario. I'm going to modify an existing table. So back to Management Studio. I'm going to show you three scenarios: adding, modifying, and deleting a column. So for adding, I'm going to add a new column in our new User Profiles table. So a new column called Name. Save. Now for modifying and deleting a column, let's go to Courses. I'm going to rename this Price column to Full Price. And let's delete this level string. And one more change. I'm going to change the data type of level from tinyInt to smallInt. So three changes in this table. I renamed price to full price, deleted the column, and changed the data type of an existing column. I also added a column in the User Profiles table. So let's see what happens. This is going to get interesting. So save. Yes. Back to the model. Again, the same process. Right click, update model from database. Now, we haven't added any new tables, so there's nothing here. Under refresh, as you see, all objects in our model will be refreshed automatically. Finish. Okay. We got two errors. Price is not mapped and level string is not mapped. Most of the time, this error automatically pops up when you update the model if there is a problem. But if it doesn't, you can always validate your model. So the way to do that is you right click on an empty area and select validate. You can also see these errors when you build the application. Okay, let's see what's happening here. It's complaining that the price is not mapped. So double click. So this price column or this price property in the course entity is not mapped. And note that we have another property called full price. So basically what happened was in the database, I renamed the price column to full price. But Entity Framework does not see that as a rename. It sees that as a new column called full price. So if you look at the mapping for this entity, we select, right click, table mapping. Look, our full price column is mapped to a new property called full price in our conceptual model. And if you see here, there is no mapping for the price property. Honestly, I'm not quite sure why Entity Framework cannot see a rename. Maybe it's deliberate, maybe it's because it assumes you might have some code against that property, so it doesn't want to mess up with your existing code. Because every time we make changes to this model and save it, the domain classes are regenerated. In such cases, what you need to do is delete this property from your conceptual model. And then when you build your application, if you have references to that property, you need to rename those references to full price manually. Now look at the second error. Level string is not mapped. This is a very similar scenario. So in the database, I deleted this column, but Entity Framework did not delete it from our conceptual model. And I think this is deliberate because perhaps it assumes that you might have some code that references that property. So the property is still there in the conceptual model. Look, it's here. It's just not mapped. And it's better to get only one error saying that this property is not mapped than 10 compile time errors because a property was automatically deleted from your domain class. The lesson is when you delete a column in your database and you get this mapping error, if you don't need it in your conceptual model, you need to manually delete that. So now I'm going to delete this. Let's right click here, validate. Okay, everything is good. Now let's take a look at the user profile entity. I added a new column in the database, and that is here. So adding always works, no problem. It's the editing and deleting that can sometimes cause a bit of problem and a bit of extra work. Actually, there was one more change that I did in the course table. I changed the data type of level from tiny int to small int. So right click. Note that Entity Framework did not change the type of this property. It's still a byte. Let's take a look at the mapping. So select this, right click, table mapping. So it knows that in the database, the level column is a small integer, but it did not change the level property in the domain class from byte to int16 because this is a safe conversion. Any number that we store in a byte, we can always store it in a column with a small int. But now let me show you a more complex scenario. So back to Management Studio. This time I'm going to change the data type of the level column to something non-compatible. Varchar. Save. Back to the Visual Studio. Let's update the model. Finish. Look, we got a validation error. It's complaining about the mapping. Member mapping specified is not valid. So if we take a look at the level property here, right click, properties, it's still a byte. Look, it's still a byte. But if we take a look at the mapping, you see that in the database, it's a varchar. And that's why we get this error. Because Entity Framework does not know how to map a byte to a varchar. So in situations like that, you need to manually change the data type of your properties. So in this case, we need to go to level, right click, properties, change that from byte to string. And of course, once I save the model and the domain classes are regenerated, it is a chance that I may get compile time error. If I have assigned a number to that property, then that code is going to break. So these are some of the issues that you need to be aware of when you are working with the entity data model. Now let's validate again. Okay, the error is gone. Now the last scenario. I'm going to delete a table from the database. So this table that I just created, user profiles, I'm going to delete it. So back to the model. Right click, update model from database. Let's go to the delete tab. Entity Framework knows that we have deleted the user profiles table from our database. So finish. Now we see a familiar error. Entity type user profile is not mapped. Again, when you delete something from the database, Entity Framework does not delete it from your model, from your conceptual model, because you might have code around that. So it's up to you to go and manually fix these problems. In this case, we need to delete this entity here if we don't need it. But before I do that, let's take a look at the model browser. So under entity types, we have the user profile. But if you look under store, tables, we don't have the user profiles table here. So Entity Framework deleted that from our storage model, but the entity is still there, here, and it's not mapped to anything. So select, delete. Now right click, validate, beautiful. So the takeaway from this lecture is that adding objects to the database is always easy, but when you modify or delete something in the database, sometimes you may have to do some manual work to clean up your model.